Welcome to the Read-aloud for Monday, March 30th. This is the Wednesday Wars, October Part 3. Make sure you have your question sheet. You've got 5 questions today. Why do teachers bring up Shakespeare? Why couldn't Mrs. Baker get rid of Caliban and Sycorax? Why was Holling stunned? What was the only thing left behind? What are the plays of William Shakespeare? And I think part of the questions got cut off because there were more, but only 5 on here, so just 5, and don't worry about the ones that got cut off. Reading Shakespeare. Of all the strategies Mrs. Baker could come up with, this must be the worst. Teachers bring up Shakespeare only to bore students to death. That's number 1. And I was going to be bored to death for 8 months. No human being could stand it. Are you sure you don't want me to pound erasers instead? Mrs. Baker shook her head. There's only one last chore, she said. Sycorax and Caliban need their cage cleaned out. I looked across the classroom at Sycorax and Caliban. I haven't told you about Sycorax and Caliban yet. You might want to skip over this next part since it's pretty awful. Because Sycorax and Caliban were rats. Every other classroom in Camillo Junior High had fish, or hamsters, or gerbils, or mice. But no, we had rats. The reason we had rats, Mrs. Baker told us, is that Lieutenant Tybalt Baker had picked them out for her when they were only cute little balls of fuzz and pink snouts playing in clean, aromatic cedar shavings. He had seen them in a pet shop window. When he went inside and put his finger to the cage, one of them had come up and licked it. Right then, he decided they needed a good home. So here they were in our classroom, and Mrs. Baker was not going to get rid of anything that Lieutenant Baker had given her, even if she wouldn't go near them herself. That's number 2. Actually, no one in the class had ever gone near Sycorax and Caliban, not even Doug Switek, and he would do anything, because they weren't cute balls of fuzz anymore. They looked like they weighed about 15 pounds each. They had hair the color of cardboard in splotches over parts of their bodies, but mostly they were just yellow and scabby skinned. If anyone even looked at them, they threw themselves against the sides of the cage and stuck their scabby snouts out as far as they could and clacked their long yellow teeth together. The sounds that came out of their throats were never heard anywhere else in nature. They probably carried the plague. I can't clean the cage with them in it, I said. In the cupboard beneath the counter is a smaller cage. Pour some food into it, put the door to that cage next to the door to the bigger cage, and open both the doors. Sycorax and Caliban will run into the smaller cage, and then you can clean their bigger cage. It sounded too easy, and I looked at Mrs. Baker to see if something in her eyes said plot. But I couldn't see her eyes because she was opening an ancient green book and turning the pages. Hurry, Mr. Hood-Hood, so we can enjoy the play, she said. I found the small cage in the cupboard, and even though I didn't think it would work, just like Mrs. Baker had said, it actually did. The rats were so hungry, I guess, that they would have done anything to get at the food. They probably would have eaten chalk-covered cream puffs. So when I opened the doors, Sycorax and Caliban laid off sticking out their scabby snouts and clacking their yellow teeth and just rioted into the smaller cage. Then I carried the big cage outside to the garbage cans, holding it as far away from me as I could. I dumped everything, then carried the cage to the faucet near Mr. Vendlary's office. I hosed it down from about 20 feet away. I wasn't going to touch anything I didn't have to. I got paper towels from the boys' restroom and dried the whole thing off. Then I carried it back upstairs into the classroom, spread out new sawdust, there was a whole bucket of it in the back of the cupboard, and filled the food and water dishes in the big cage. In the small cage, Caliban and Sycorax were back to their scabby snout and yellow teeth routine, but they were a little less frantic about it, probably because they had just stuffed themselves. The blacks of their eyes seemed almost natural, not like they were possessed. I slid the 2 cages together, held them tightly against each other, and opened the doors. Sycorax and Caliban started to clamber in. By the way, said Mrs. Baker from her desk, Teachers do not bring up Shakespeare to bore their students to death. I was stunned. She could tell what I had been thinking. That's number 3. So you see, what happened next wasn't my fault at all. I turned around, stunned, and looked at her, and I felt the 2 cages move apart. "Mr. Hood," cried Mrs. Baker, suddenly standing up. Sycorax and Caliban each had half their bodies pushed into the space between the 2 cages. Their scabby snouts were twitching triumphantly, and their teeth were clacking as close to my thumbs as they could get. I smashed the 2 cages together hard, and they let out a high, awful rat screech. They both turned their little black eyes toward me, bulging with demonic light, and clawed hysterically at the bars that were hardly holding them from escape, and they kept on screeching. "Don't hurt them," cried Mrs. Baker, who was now halfway across the room. So I pulled apart the 2 cages just a little bit, and Sycorax whirled, hissed, threw herself on top of Caliban, and pushed through. Then she leaped at my thumb, her yellow jaws open. "Oh," I said, and jumped back from the cages. "Hiss," said Caliban, and jumped out from the cages. "Screech," said Sycorax, and jumped down from the counter. "Hiss," said Caliban again, and jumped down from the counter over the cupboard after her. "Oh," said Mrs. Baker, and jumped onto Danny Hupfer's desk. "Oh," I said again, as Sycorax and Caliban ran over my foot, and headed into the coat room, where they threw themselves into the pile of fungus lunch remnants. Mrs. Baker and I were both breathing pretty hard by this time, so what she said next came out in a sort of strangled whisper. "Go get Mr. Van Larry, quick." I did, jumping from desk to desk, since I wasn't going to take any chances. Over my foot! I didn't tell Mr. Van Larry what we needed him for until we got to the classroom, because I wasn't certain that he would come if I did. He looked at us with wide eyes while we told him. I was back up on a desk. Then he nodded, went down the hall to the supply closet, and came back with a shovel and 2 brooms. "You flush them out from that side," he said. "I'll be waiting with the shovel." "Flush them out?" I said. "Don't hurt them," said Mrs. Baker. "Flush them out?" I said again, because I thought maybe they hadn't heard me. I won't hurt them unless they're going to hurt me," said Mr. Van Larry, which is exactly what they tried to do. Mrs. Baker and I climbed down from the desks. "Flush them out?" I said a 3rd time. "Mr. Hood, be bold," said Mrs. Baker. Let me tell you, we probably did not look bold as we crept toward the coat room with our brooms, or when we poked at the moldering lunch remnants, or when we peered behind the coats still hanging there. And I know we didn't look bold when the rats erupted from Doug Switek's coat with a full-scale screech. They howled and roared and slobbered toward Mr. Van Larry, Sycorax with a decaying cream puff still in her yellow jaws. We heard Mr. Van Larry holler, "Oh!" And by the time we got to the other side of the coat room, Mr. Van Larry was up on Danny Hupfer's desk. "They climbed into the radiators," he said, pointing, but they weren't there long. We heard hissing, we heard scrambling up the walls, we heard heavy pattering across the asbestos ceiling tiles. Then all was silence. The only thing left behind was the cream puff. And that is number 4. Abandoned before Sycorax had climbed into the radiator. "I'd better tell Mr. Guareschi," said Mr. Van Larry. Mrs. Baker, who had somehow gotten up onto her desk, looked at me, then at the cream puff, and then back at me. "Perhaps you had better hurry," she said. And that was all, nothing about the cream puff. Whatever this new strategy was, it was good. So Mr. Van Larry went to report, and soon Mr. Guareschi arrived at the scene of the escape. He was breathing heavily, since principals and dictators of small countries aren't used to running. He looked over the 2 cages, peered into the coat room, and then put his ear to the wall. "I don't hear a thing," he said. None of us did either. "They might be gone," said Mr. Van Larry hopefully. "How did they get out in the first place?" Mr. Guareschi asked, as if that made a whole lot of difference right now. I was